Hi there. Today's podcast, we're going to be setting the stage for some pelvic floor 101. We need to start with what the heck is the pelvic floor? As a physical therapist with a specialty working with clients and patients overcoming pelvic floor dysfunction, I talk about it all the time. And I quickly have been reminded that when I'm chatting with family and friends, this is not typically brought up in conversations over coffee or at happy hour, but maybe it should be. So, my goal is for creating this podcast to share knowledge and encouragement and intentional conversations around women's health, nutrition, and wellness for new mothers. In this episode, I'm going to touch on what the pelvic floor is and some pelvic floor lingo, some simple anatomy, and then talking through the 5 functions of the pelvic floor. Let's get going. So, what is the pelvic floor? The pelvic floor is a group of muscles within the base of your pelvis, and they help support your pelvic organs. They hold in pee and poop until you're ready to empty, and then they have a role in sexual function and childbirth. So that's kind of overarching kind of what it is. And I don't want to completely nerd out on the anatomy and some of that stuff with you, but I do want to give you guys some information. And I think that it's important to have a general understanding of our bodies and anatomy, especially for the pelvic floor. It's something that's so important and powerful for our bodies. And the more that we know, the more that we can set ourselves up for awareness and confidence in our bodies, especially in the postpartum season. So let's jump into some pelvic floor lingo. So the first one, I have my lovely pelvis, Poppy the pelvis here. So if you're looking at the video recording, you'll be able to kind of see me pointing out some things. But if you're listening in on a podcast, just go ahead. You can kind of visualize and kind of see what I'm talking about, or check out the video later. So when we're talking about some pelvic floor lingo, the one that I wanted to start with is your pelvic girdle. So your pelvic girdle is the bones specifically that make up this area. So it's talking about your specifically the ilium, ischium, and pubis. So the ilium's up here. So you think about kind of the hip crest and the top part. The ischium's over here, down below, like where your sit bones are, and then your pubis, which is kind of that front harder bone at the base of the pelvis. And your pelvic girdle makes a ring shape, and it's the framework for your pelvic floor muscles to attach and connect to in the pelvic region, as well as other muscles from the spine and some of the lower extremities and throughout the hip. So pelvic girdle can be a term that's used for women postpartum or during pregnancy. Sometimes they'll experience pelvic girdle pain. And this is something that can be treated, but it's something that usually with some of that ligament laxity, with some of the tendons and ligaments having a little bit more give, sometimes these bones can elicit for some pain for some people. And then, so from the pelvic girdle, I wanted to touch on then the pelvis. So that is big picture, this whole region. So including the muscles, including the soft tissue, including ligaments and tendons and arteries and veins and all of those things, the nerves, all of that connective tissue. There's fascia too, which is kind of like a nice connective tissue. But there's so much in addition to the bones and the muscles. So thinking about your pelvis is the area that's formed from these 2 hip bones. So we're talking about kind of that girdle. And then we're also talking about the sacrum or your tailbone, and then that connecting piece. So your pelvis is that connecting piece between your upper body and your lower body. So pretty important, I'd say. All right. And then the next one we're going to talk through is your pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor is a group of muscles, and we'll dive into some more specifics on that in a little bit. But the pelvic floor is kind of that bottom of the pelvis. So you can see here, I'm holding up that anatomy. So you can see the red on here is representing muscles. And this is from the top down view as well. So you can see that there's kind of this bowl or almost funnel shape of muscles that are within our pelvis. And then the perineum. So the perineum is from the pubic bone. So if you were to touch your belly button and then go down a couple of inches, you're going to find a pretty kind of solid, hard spot right at the bottom of your pelvis, and that's your pubic bone. And the muscles that attach from there to your coccyx or your tailbone. And this area, as a physical therapist, pelvic health physical therapist, is really important during an assessment. So when we're asking someone to contract and relax or do a Kegel, some people will call it, when you're doing a pelvic floor contraction, that's really important and gives me some information on kind of what's going on. So I'm looking at basically what your ability to contract, relax, or lengthen and shorten those muscles are, as well as some of the coordination piece. So the perineum is that area from the front of the pelvis to your tailbone. And it's just that entire area through there. And then I wanted to touch on also that there is 2 triangles of the pelvic floor. So you have a urogenital triangle, and that houses where your urethra is. So when you pee, that's where pee comes out. And then also your vaginal opening is in the urogenital triangle. And then there's a rectal triangle, and the rectal triangle is where we poop out of. And so you can kind of see from here. So the urogenital triangle is here, and then the rectal triangle. I'm holding up Poppy, the pelvis for those of you on the video. And then last term for our pelvic floor lingo is the vulva. Yes, with an A, the vulva. I've definitely had some people think I was referring to the car, and kind of looked at me like I was just being weird talking about a car while I was doing an assessment, but nope, I'm just talking about anatomy. So it's a term specific for the female external genitalia. And I like to describe it that it's unique and there's a wide range of normal appearance, just like our faces. So just like we all have our own unique beauty features, the vulva is similar in that way, that we all have a nose, but our noses look differently. So same thing, we all have different tissues down in our vulvar region. So specifically, a lot of the times what we call the labia majora, minora, or the lips. Sometimes those can be pretty different on people, and the color and pubic hair and things like that. So it can look very different, but they function the same. So it's just one of those unique things about us and how we were made. Okay, so that was some of the pelvic floor lingo I wanted to take you guys through. And we're going to move into the anatomy. So, as I mentioned before, there are 3 layers of the pelvic floor, which is pretty cool. So the first layer is closer to the surface, or we'd call it superficial. And so you can basically find it from the outside and touching down through those areas, as well as going into your first knuckle. And that helps kind of with getting the underside, where on the other side of this bone, that first layer can be in. So I'm just pointing at the inside of the pubic rami here. So then other part of layer 1 that's important is that for some women, if they have pain with intercourse on that kind of initial penetration, sometimes there's some involvement with that layer 1 of muscles. So again, I will touch on some of these specific diagnoses and symptoms in future episodes, but just trying to tie it all in a little bit for those of you listening. So layer 2 has a urogenital diaphragm. That's just kind of the fancy term of saying that's where the structures that help open and close our urethra and the vaginal opening are pretty much housed there. It's a pretty thick, fibrous, kind of dense piece of connective tissue. And compared to the first and the third layers, it's pretty much just kind of like a sheet in those areas. And it's, again, like I said, for opening and closing the sphincters. And some of you may have experienced firsthand when these muscles need some more training and attention. Yes, I'm talking about those of you that experience leaking with running, laughing, lifting and coughing and all of those things. But don't worry, we'll have a specific stress incontinence episode in the future, I promise. So we have our layer 1, our layer 2, and then your layer 3 of muscles, which is about your third knuckle depth. And when I'm referring to the knuckle depth, that's during a pelvic floor assessment if we were going to be checking that vaginally, with consent, of course. But these muscles during the pelvic, in that pelvic 3 layer, help with supporting and lifting and stabilizing. So supporting our organs and kind of lifting those areas up off of the actual pelvic floor, and then stabilizing our core specifically as well. And these muscles are located on either side of the pelvis. And then also, if you're sitting down, you can actually feel kind of where those muscles are of your actual pelvic floor. That can take you through a little way to find the pelvic floor in our next episode. And then the muscles also, which is pretty cool, is that in that 3rd layer, we can actually get to some of the deep hip rotators from the internal side that can sometimes lead to people with hip pain, pelvic pain, or low back pain, or pain with intercourse. So it's pretty interesting how all of these things are so interconnected, and how many muscles and structures and pieces of anatomy that we have in this area of our pelvis. It's pretty powerful, which is really, really awesome. Okay, I hope I didn't bore you too much with the anatomy and talking about some of that, but I wanted to talk about also the 5 functions of the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor has 5 functions. So stability, it's stabilizing with connecting joints and structures in and around the pelvis. And there's so many ligaments and tendons that help kind of do that, as well as in that pelvic region. So it's for stability as well as core stability. It's the bottom of our core, which is really important for when we're doing any activities, whether that's higher level, more dynamic things like working out or playing with your kids, but also for even just sitting, standing. It provides so much stability for your body. And then it's also supportive. So it's supporting your pelvic organs, especially that 3rd layer. So that deepest layer we were talking about, that bowl or almost hammock of muscles that really helps support those pelvic organs. So thinking about your bladder, your uterus, the intestines, and all of those things that are tight inside of us. It's supporting those organs within our pelvis. And then the 3rd function is sexual function. So it aids in sexual function and performance and pleasure. The 1st layer of pelvic floor muscles is really important with that pleasure piece, and being able to perform sexual function, obviously, with the openings as well for the pelvic floor. We have to make sure that we can open and close them when appropriately. And that leads us to function number 4, which is the sphincteric function. So this helps with urinary and fecal continence. So helping us to close those sphincters and not go to the bathroom when we don't want to or don't have the resources available to go to the bathroom. But then we also need to know when to open or have that ability to go to the bathroom is also a very important aspect of their role. And then the last function of the pelvic floor is a sump pump. So it acts as more of like getting some of the blood flow and circulation out of the pelvis, because again, there are so many organs in those areas and blood vessels and muscles and all of that. And we would just want to make sure that we're pumping all of those things out. And our pelvic floor helps with that contraction and relaxation and just natural functioning of the pelvic floor. So again, the 5 functions of the pelvic floor: stability, support, sexual function, sphincteric, and sump pump. All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you were able to get some pearls of information to take home with you. And I'm really looking forward to sharing more with you very soon about some of the common pelvic floor dysfunctions that I see in our clinic, and provide you with tools to empower you along the way. Take care, ladies, and I'll talk to you soon.